Hello?
Hey, Rich, it's Larson. You got a minute?
Sure, Larson, what's up?
Well, hello and welcome to the Got a Minute podcast. It's Larson Hicks, together with my esteemed co-host, the one and only Rich the Vicar Lusk.
Yeah, Larson, great to be with you. It's been a while.
It has been a while, man. It's good to see your face. It's good to hear your voice. It's been kind of a busy season, I'm sure, for both of us with the holidays and everything. Yeah. But yeah, and I look like I got in a bar fight here. You know, the hazards of having children and playing rough.
You should see them, though, right? They're even more beat up than you. Is that right?
That's right. So why don't you pick up from, what do you guys do for Epiphany at your church?
Yeah, so we do acknowledge different seasons of the year. And Epiphany is that season that comes after Christmas. In fact, just to kind of give people a sense, because I know a lot of people probably are in churches that don't acknowledge the season of Epiphany. So the church year starts with Advent, which is 4 weeks in front of Christmas. And yes. Advent really is a time of preparation. Advent especially focuses on those Old Testament promises and prophecies, God's promise to send a Messiah. And of course, that comes to culmination in Jesus' birth, which we celebrate at Christmas. And Christmas is a 12-day season, starting December 25th and running through January 5th. January 5th, of course, is 12th night. I think the 12 days of Christmas, it's a wonderful way to stretch out Christmas, stretch out the celebration. There's so many, obviously, themes that are connected with Christmas and so many great hymns and so forth. Yes. I've known families that have stretched out their gift giving over all 12 days and those kind of things just to take advantage of that. So I think that's a great way to think about it. You've got Advent and Christmas, and that kind of forms a cycle, those two together. And Epiphany can really, in a way, be considered the extension of Christmas. Okay. The word Epiphany means manifestation or revelation. And so Epiphany is really all about the manifestation of Jesus' identity, the revelation of who he is and what he came to do. So, for example, the wise men, you could say the magi who come from the east, these royal figures who come to Jesus bringing gifts, chronologically, they belong with the season of Christmas because I believe they're there at Jesus' birth. They're there, right. Still in Bethlehem. On the other hand, thematically, they really belong with Epiphany because the wise men coming to worship Jesus reveals or manifests Jesus as one who came to be the Savior of the nations. This is the fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 60 that talks about when the glory of Israel arises, the nations will be drawn to it and they will come bringing their gifts. And that's the Magi are sort of the first fruits of that. So Epiphany is a season that and because we're in Epiphany right now, I'll say a little bit more about it. Epiphany focuses on things like the coming of the Magi. It really focuses on events that take place either at the very beginning of Jesus' life or the very beginning of his ministry. So the Magi coming at his infancy, showing he's a savior for the Gentiles too. The beginning of his public ministry, the baptism of Jesus. So that's what I preached on this last Sunday, because typically the first Sunday in Epiphany Sunday, focuses on the baptism of Jesus. His first miracle at the wedding in Cana of Galilee in John chapter 2, which, because it's his first miracle, it really reveals who he is and what he has come to do. So those are things that are packed into Epiphany. There's a classic hymn from the 4th century called "When Christ's Appearing Was Made Known" by Cellius Sedulius. Okay, that's a great name, Cellius Sedulius. If you got anybody that's listening to our show that's got a child on the way, consider that name Cellius.
That's strong. That's really strong. It's got a good ring to it.
It's a good, strong name. But that hymn basically covers all the Epiphany bases. So if you go look up that hymn, you'll find this is a hymn that it runs the gamut of what Epiphany is about.
I love it.
So Epiphany does not have a set length. Epiphany runs up until the beginning of the season of Lent. And so a lot of times Epiphany would end with for English-speaking churches, what's called a Shrove Tuesday feast, where basically all those things that you might be giving up during Lent or that would not be available to you during Lent, you would have a big feast, a big celebration with those things. Epiphany, like Christmas, really is a feast season. So it really does extend the Christmas feasting, the Christmas celebration.
Shrove Tuesday, is that kind of like where Mardi Gras comes from?
It's the English-speaking version of Mardi Gras. Yeah, I mean, Mardi Gras obviously has all kinds of of connotations now that you wouldn't want to
Sure.
be associated with.
Sure.
A lot of churches will do like a Shrove Tuesday pancake feast or something like that. That's something that we've done, and it's not because we're even expecting people to fast during the season of Lent, but it's a good way to wrap up the season of Epiphany with a feast. Just like you wrap up the season of Christmas with a 12th night feast, you wrap up the season of Epiphany with a Shrove Tuesday feast.
Yes.
And then Lent runs 40 days, but of course you don't count Sundays because Sundays are always feast days. So you begin Lent, you begin the season of Lent with Ash Wednesday, and then that runs up through what we call Holy Week or Passion Week, which has Maundy Thursday when Jesus is in the upper room with his disciples, Good Friday when he dies on the cross, Holy Saturday when he is buried, and then of course Easter begins with Easter Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And so you move from this time of focusing on Jesus' suffering and his temptation and his trial and his death. You move from there into a celebration of his resurrection. And Easter lasts 50 days. It's important to recognize that too, that Easter is such a big, grand, glorious event. It's got 50 days in the calendar. Inside of that 50 days, of course, on the 40th day, you've got Ascension Thursday, when Jesus ascended into the heavens. And the reason we say that Easter runs 50 days is because 50 days out is Pentecost. Okay. Pentecost in the Old Covenant calendar was 50 days after Passover, basically. So that's where that comes from. It's 50 days after Easter because Jesus was crucified at Passover. And so Pentecost, of course, the Israelites knew that as the giving of the law. We know it as the giving of the Spirit. Okay. When the law was given, a bunch of people died. When the Spirit was given, a bunch of people were brought to new life. And so we celebrate the gift of the Holy Spirit. And then following Pentecost Sunday, you have Trinity Sunday because the story the calendar tells is a Trinitarian story. It's about the Father sending the Son, and now the Father sending the Spirit through the Son. So it's a Trinitarian story. So you have Trinity Sunday to kind of wrap things up. And then Trinity Sunday begins what is called ordinary time because it doesn't have a particular theme connected to the life of Christ. But typically, sometimes it's known as the season of Pentecost or the season of Trinity. But it's a season of the church year that focuses on the growth and mission and maturation of the church. And that runs all the way until 5 Sundays before Christmas, when you have what's called Christ the King Sunday. And that's kind of a newcomer to the calendar. And a lot of people don't like it because they'll say, oh, well, hey, Jesus already became king in his resurrection. Jesus already became king in his ascension. So isn't Christ the King Sunday, isn't that redundant? But actually, I think the proper way to view Christ the King Sunday is to say Christ the King Sunday looks ahead. All these other things that we're celebrating in the church calendar are mainly looking back to what Jesus has already done. Christ the King Sunday, or it's also sometimes called Fulfillment Sunday. I think that would be fine too. Or you could call it Final Coming Sunday. It focuses on the final coming of Jesus. A great time to break out some of those final coming hymns, maybe preach a sermon on Jesus' final coming, something like that. To remind people that this story's not over. The story the calendar tells is moving towards its ultimate conclusion when Jesus comes again at the last day. And we've got what we call the 4 great certainties. So his final coming, the resurrection of the body, the righteous and unrighteous, judgment day, and then the final state for the wicked in the lake of fire and for the righteous in the consummated form of the new creation. So Christ the King Sunday, I think, is a good way to kind of tie things off. If you don't, people who objected to Christ the King Sunday and have said, well, Christ is already king, so this is redundant. I would say, well, then treat it as a 5th Sunday of Advent. Historically, Advent focused not only on the promise of Christ's first coming, but also the promise of his final coming. The problem is, in those 4 Sundays before Christmas, you can't really get people to think about the final coming of Jesus. They want to focus on his coming birth. You can't really get people to think about all that's going to happen when Jesus comes again because they're focused on what happened when he came the first time. So it's really hard to layer those things on top of each other. You get odd readings and odd hymn choices if you try to make Advent do double duty and kind of cover the first and final comings of Jesus. So I like Christ the King Sunday because it takes that pressure off of Advent, and it just gives us a Sunday to say, even if you don't preach a sermon on it, just to say, hey, it's Christ the King Sunday, and this is the Sunday when we especially look ahead to Jesus' final coming. He has come. He will come again. This story's not over. He's coming at the last day to complete the victory he's already won, to complete the redemption that he's already accomplished. And we have a Sunday at the very end of the church year set aside for all of that. Now, that is sometimes called the Dominical cycle, running from Advent through Christ the King Sunday, from the promise of his first coming to celebrating his final coming. Layered on top of that is what you could call the ecclesiastical calendar. So you got the Dominical calendar, which focuses on the life of Jesus. You've got the ecclesiastical calendar, which includes saints' days. So this is where, for example, St. Patrick's Day would fit in, or anything you wanted to do like that. Some could make the argument that Columbus Day is as much of a church festival as it is a civic holiday, because he was in a lot of ways a Christian missionary, seeking to spread the kingdom of Christ, however imperfectly he may have done so. Reformation Sunday, All Saints Sunday, those are part of the ecclesiastical calendar, ecclesiastical cycle. So things like that kind of layered on top of the Dominical cycle, focused on the life of Jesus and sort of growing out of it. So there are things that you can do with that as well. But what I think the value in it, and obviously I think it's really important to be clear about this, there is no divine obligation to follow the church calendar. The New Testament makes it really clear that while God gave to Israel a calendar, in the New Covenant era, Christians are not bound by those days and seasons any longer. So we're free from the Jewish calendar. What's interesting to me is that the Jews could actually add to and modify that calendar as God did new things. So the calendar is prescribed in the Torah. And you might think, well, wouldn't it always be wrong to add to the Torah? Well, apparently not in this sense. So, for example, in the book of Esther, when the Jews are, there's a death decree against the Jews, they're delivered because of the bravery of Mordecai and Esther. And they celebrate that with the Feast of Purim, and that gets added to the calendar. Later on in the intertestamental period, they add the Feast of Hanukkah or the Feast of Lights because the temple had been captured. They rededicate the temple, and they begin to celebrate the Feast of Lights or Hanukkah. And Jesus observed the Feast of Lights in the Gospels. So in the Gospel of John. So it obviously was not wrong or sinful for them to add to the calendar. So on the one hand, we're not under the old covenant calendar anymore. On the other hand, we see freedom to develop a calendar that highlights and that celebrates the things that God has done for his people and promises to do in the future for his people. And so the church has taken that and said, well, how can we, people are going to track time anyway. They're going to track days and weeks and months anyway. Is there a way that we can express Christ's dominion over time and learn to experience time Christianly, in a distinctively Christian way? And that's really what the church calendar was about. So, if you think about it, all of us have a variety of calendars that we live by. You've got a family calendar. So Larson, your family may celebrate, say, birthdays and anniversaries, and you might have a particular time every year when you go on vacation as a family. You've got a family calendar. We've got a civic calendar as America, with Labor Day and Memorial Day and the 4th of July and President's Day and things like that. And that also has its place. I don't think there's anything wrong with having that kind of calendar to acknowledge those kinds of things. But I would say the most fundamental or foundational calendar in our lives should be the church calendar. And so I think there's value in it in that sense. There's value in it as a teaching tool, as a form of yearly catechesis. I would say every local church is free to take hold of the calendar and use it, develop it, implement it in whatever way they see best for their community, and with whatever customs they see as being most fitting for their particular congregation. That's and of course you can do this in your family if your church doesn't. We just have a lot of freedom here, obviously. The calendar's made for man, not man for the calendar. And there are times in church history where the calendar's been greatly abused. This is one thing the Reformation had to clean up, was there were so many saints' days being celebrated that people were basically being lazy and not being as productive as they should have been. So the reformers cleaned that up. They rolled a bunch of those saints' days into All Saints' Day, for convenience. but as the number of martyrs and great saints began to pile up, and there's more and more days on the calendar, you at some point you have more feast days than you really should.
Right. Right.
If those feast days entail not working and so forth. So a lot of things like that to think about. I think the calendar is a great tool for catechesis for God's people. It's a great way to foster a certain kind of culture in the life of your church. So there's a lot of good things that can be done with it. There, as with anything, there are certain dangers that come with it. So you have to be careful about it.
Well, I think of it like, our church does less of it, I'm sure, than you guys, but we're sort of inching our way in. And I think our rationale has almost nothing to do with whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think we would all agree pretty heartily that it's a good thing. I think the rationale for wading in from the shallow end has more to do with not leaving people behind.
Absolutely. There's
you have to kind of consider the frame of, I've heard it said you need to move at the speed of your flock kind of thing. So there is a sense that, at our church, it feels like we've got, literally there is almost every Sunday, there are a couple of families visiting, and there's always, well, why do you guys do this? Why do you guys do that? And it's already pretty overwhelming. It was funny. I had someone come over and grill me for 10 or 15 minutes after church on Sunday. And then I walked away and then I overheard him grilling, Pastor McLean.
Right.
A lot of and so it was like, but like that. So that's kind of the context we're in, but setting that aside, cause I think that's one of the considerations you have to make as a church. Absolutely. I think, I feel like Christianity has become so individual and so cerebral. It's all about ideas that you assent to intellectually, and I think we have this like reductionistic mindset about Christianity, which is like, do I have to do this? Do I have to do that? What do I not like? What are the only essential things I have to do? And it comes down to, for most Christians today, you just need to believe in Jesus or accept Jesus into your heart. That's kind of the answer. And it's like, is anything else required? And it's like, no. Should you do anything else? No. If it's not required, you shouldn't do it. It's almost like that's kind of where we're at as a culture. And then we're surprised that our kids are catechized by the world. They're catechized by the rhythms and the patterns and the habits and the, and the things that are happening in the world around them.
Yeah.
So I see it as a way. I see it as a way to anchor. It's like, if your faith is is sort of a net or something, you're sort of just adding more and more points of contact and sort of making more and more connections and sort of tying your faith to your habits, throughout the year. So yeah. And the other thing I think too is the gospel story or message in so many modern churches is so truncated, to just this really simple thing. I think the irony is that they the argument that I'm sure a lot of modern churches would make against this kind of thing is, well, that's stuffy and that's rigid and that's too ritualistic or whatever, repetitive. And I actually think that it does the opposite, that at some level it prevents you from just getting into this rut where you're telling the same, small version of the gospel, over and over and over, or you're sort of like reacting to news cycles or whatever it is you're doing. It sort of forces you into a different pattern that sort of forces you to kind of preach through the whole story of Christ and through the whole Bible. So anyway.
Yeah, I think that's really, really good. And I would say that churches do have a tendency to get locked into certain truncated versions of the gospel. And so one thing that the calendar can do, and particularly like when you've got the hymns that go with the different seasons, is it can give you a more full-orbed, more well-rounded understanding of the gospel, what Christ has done, and also of the Christian life. So let's, I'll give you just, I'll kind of kind of give an exaggerated version of this. You might have some Christian circles where people really don't want to talk about suffering that much, like a name it and claim it kind of prosperity culture is being fostered. Well, like the season of Lent would crash right through that every year, because what the season of Lent does is it reminds us, A, Jesus came to suffer and die, and
Right.
B, the Christian life is a life of suffering and dying to self as well. You to be a Christian means you've got to take up your cross and follow Jesus. And so we get an annual reminder that the Christian life has these hard edges to it. We get this annual reminder that the Christian life is not supposed to be easy. Now, Jesus' suffering is suffering unto victory. There's nothing, there's ways you could get it wrong going the other direction and turn Lent into something that's just very morbid. And I don't think Lent is supposed to be morbid. There are certain aspects of Lent that might be, again, it's sort of a red pill you have to swallow. It can, may not go down easy, but Jesus is suffering. His suffering is how he wins. And we can say that for the church too. Soldiers on the battlefield, the army that wins the war suffered in their way to victory. They suffered on their way to victory. Their suffering was unto victory. And so so Lent is not about defeat, it's about victory, but it reminds us victory comes through suffering, sacrifice, and service. So you'd have that aspect of it. Or you've got, in other circles, you've got a very truncated view of the gospel where there's not really a sufficient understanding of Jesus' present lordship and his present reign. And I would say that if you do Easter right, you're going to have this sense that the risen Christ is now Lord. That when he steps out of that grave, he is inaugurating a new creation. His kingdom is being established. He now reigns over everything. He's King of Kings, Lord of Lords. But having an annual remembrance and celebration of his ascension into heaven, where he is seated on the throne at the Father's right hand, is a really good reminder that Jesus is king right now, and that we can't privatize his lordship as though his lordship was confined to our hearts. His lordship is public. It's cosmic, it's universal. He reigns over everything. And so I actually think that a right use of the church calendar would sort of be a way of correcting a lot of imbalances that you have in the evangelical church, where things have gotten kind of off kilter and we don't have that full orbed gospel that scripture. I mean, I wrote a whole book about this called Measures of the Mission to get at this same thing, how we privatized the gospel and truncated the gospel. But one sort of way of getting at this is to understand, the church calendar can bring us to a deeper understanding of these things. If you've got a church that's not really very oriented towards doing evangelism or participating in some way in the global spread of the gospel in missions, Epiphany is great, because Epiphany really is about the mission of Jesus to be the savior of the nations. And the corresponding aspect of the Christian life, or the corresponding aspect of the church's life to that, of course, is that we participate in that mission now. Jesus has accomplished redemption, but we're called to carry forward that mission now of taking his gospel to the nations. And so we want the nations to have an epiphany. We want Christ to be manifested to the nations. We want the nations to have a revelation of Christ's glory, just like the wise men did. They saw the glory and were drawn to it. We want to show the nations the glory so they'll be drawn to it.
Well, I think I love all of that, and I think the thing that I come back to in all of this, we use the phrase catechize. The church calendar kind of is a form of catechesis. I think that part of our job, obviously, in the Great Commission, is to disciple the nations, and that most certainly includes our children. And I think that church, it reminds me of there's a song that we sang this year at Christmas. I'm gonna forget the name of the song, but at one point in the song we stomp, right? There's like this, it's become sort of a thing where people sing it, and at a certain point everyone stomps, and you do it on every verse. And my son is up in Idaho, and his music teacher apparently hates that people stomp, because he's like, there's no reason musically and there's no reason theologically to do it. And he mentioned that to us when he was home. And I just said, if you are having to make that argument, you've already lost the argument. Like if people want to stomp there, if the church wants to stomp, then they should stomp, and the best argument is, if you look out in the crowd And of all the songs on on that Sunday that we sing, that's the one that all the kids are like they hear the first stomp and all of a sudden they're all like fully tuned in and wanting to get the next one, And so it's sort of like again, I hate that reductionistic, like there's no explicit reason to do this, therefore we're forbidden to do it, And when I think that there should be this like kind of gospel maximalism kind of mindset that we have, where it's like, hey, we want everything to just be saturated with gospel and ordain. And I think about like illuminated manuscripts and like, medieval churches that are just covered. Every corner of the church is covered in decorations and imagery and symbolism. And it's like, did they have to do any of that? No, but were they wanting to just cram it in everywhere? They could. And of course, I know maybe you taught me this, but illuminated manuscripts are I've heard it argued we're actually meant to be an aid to Bible memorization and teaching. So, anyway.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, so you might say like with the stomping in that song, or like we've got a hymn. It's a version of Psalm 98 where people will clap, at a point where
all people clap your hands.
All people clap your hands. Yeah. People clap, and so you could argue that something like that, what does it add? Is it a distraction? But part of it is I think people just enjoy it, and I think it's hard to stand in the way of something like that when people enjoy it. So you might have some purists who would complain about that, but I agree with you. You're not going to really dissuade people from it.
If we're getting more people involved, and if there's a strong argument against it, by all means, don't do it. But if there's not a strong argument against it, and it's something that is a delight and a joy for everybody to do, then don't be Scrooge. It sounds like you guys are having too much fun.
Right. Yeah.
Well, let's move on to the next topic. We wanted to do kind of a smorgasbord this episode. We had a few different topics. So what the next one on the list I was thinking about was, I've seen on Twitter, you've been doing a lot of commenting and posting, and I've noticed you making some comments about which posts are getting more engagement and others, and I know that you've kind of had some explicit sort of intentional experiments you've been running with kind of the anti-Semites on X. So what's that all about?
Yeah. Well, so let me talk about this, because if our listeners are not aware, I am on X, the app formerly known as Twitter.
That's right.
I am at Vicar 1973. So Vicar, VICAR 1973. That's where you can find me. And I'm kind of sporadically active. Much of what I post are things that I wrote, years ago that I just trot out. Sometimes I'm interacting with things that are more current. I don't put a whole lot of time into it. My long form posts are pretty much always things I've already written. But I got active last summer, or maybe it's into the fall before I really kind of got to where I was doing stuff more regularly. But I've had an account for many years. I just didn't do anything with it. Hardly ever looked at it. Certainly, very rarely would post anything, or, like I said, really even look at it. But several things happened, so there were several reasons why I was really not active on it. One is I really do think there are all kinds of dangers bound up in social media, not just for kids, especially for kids, but also for adults. So I think we have to be very aware of that. If I'm actually reading right now, Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, which covers I think in excruciating detail, just how much damage social media has done. He's really focused more on children and how we have replaced a play-based childhood with a phone-based childhood, and how bad that has been for kids. But obviously a lot of the addictive aspects of it, how social media can kind of get its hook in you. It's designed to use your own psychology against you and to hook you with these little dopamine hits and that kind of thing.
For sure.
That impacts all of us. It shortens attention span. It becomes a breeding ground for discontentment and for anger. There's just all kinds of potential pitfalls with it. And I stayed away from it for the most part, really all of it. I mean, I posted very little on Facebook, although that would have been the one I used the most. Was not really active on Twitter at all. And that was really all that I had an account for. part of that for all these, for many years was that I was trying to minimize my kids' engagement with social media as they were growing up. And so it didn't make a lot of sense necessarily for me to be super engaged with social media when I was trying to keep them off of it for the most part. But now my kids are grown and they can make their own decisions about those things. And that's not something that I'm really worried about. But there's something else that happened that made me interested in getting more active on X is where I chose to go, just because it seems like it's the closest thing you have now to a sort of public community square or sort of public bulletin board where there's just kind of this free for all. And of course, it's also the one that's best known now for free speech. Although I find it interesting that, Zuckerberg for all these years said that Facebook was not censoring. And now he's come out and said, we're going to stop censoring. So,
right.
Figure that out. But when Elon Musk bought Twitter, that was a game changer. And, people have talked about, and I think we've talked about on this podcast before, the vibe shift that's taken place. And I think there's a reality to that, a vibe shift that's taken place, partly because Christians and conservatives just have much better arguments than liberals and progressives do. So in a battle of ideas, in the marketplace of ideas or the battleground of ideas, so to speak, I really believe that Christians and conservatives will win, if that's just all that it's about. So the fact that Musk purchased Twitter, turned it into X, and basically provided this free speech platform for the world to use, it's like, if he could spend that much money on it, maybe I should make use of it and take advantage of that. I was seeing so many other pastors talk about how, while Twitter is in many ways a cesspool, or X is a cesspool, there were also some good things that were coming out of their engagement there. Good conversations and good forms of apologetics or gospel ministry, evangelism, all kinds of other good things that were coming out of it. And certainly it's a place where a lot of young men are. And so if you're concerned for the well-being, spiritual and otherwise, of young men today, it's a place to be where you can reach young men. And so I saw it as kind of a strategic thing with the vibe shift, kind of a new openness to Christian and I'll just say, for lack of a better term, conservative ideas in the public square. I mean, quite honestly, I think Musk's purchase of X, whatever the company's worth today compared to what he paid for it, it's still been a bargain, because it has generated already so much cultural influence. I'm not sure that Trump defeats Kamala without X, without that platform being available for free speech. And, while Trump's not the be all and end all, he's definitely preferable to Kamala. So there, again, there's a lot of reasons there why I've gotten involved. I have been, in many cases, encouraged by what I've seen, but also in some cases, you could say, just perplexed or concerned about what I've seen. And particularly some of this has come from, I know there's a lot of debate about anonymous accounts, and I don't think you can really generalize too much about anonymous accounts, because some are obviously really smart, savvy, well thought out people, and others just seem to be full of anger, and it especially seems in a lot of cases angry young men. So I was actually asked, and I haven't committed to it. That's why I'm sort of running these experiments on X. I've thought about doing a book on Ordo Amoris, the Order of Loves, which would embrace things like, it would include a discussion of things like nationalism and patriotism, how our loyalty to the church fits in with other loyalties like loyalty to family and nation. It would deal with questions like love of people and place, and how that bears upon the question of race and ethnicity. And what about racism? Is there such a sin as racism, and all these different kinds of things? And of course, that gets you into anti-Semitism. And that's one thing that I've noticed, is that really two things have stood out to me. One, you have a whole crop of, it seems to be mostly younger men. But when I say younger, I mean, I think they could be into their 40s. But certainly younger than that too. A lot of young men who do seem very angry about the fact that they feel like the world has cheated them, like the whole world has been. These are younger white men who feel like the world has been prejudiced and biased against them. And I certainly think that's true. One of the most interesting books I read in 2024 was Jeremy Carl's book, The Unprotected Class, which is basically it's a really helpful book. It's very insightful. I didn't know anything about the author when I picked up the book, and I was wondering if this was going to be just kind of an angry screed. And it's actually very careful. I don't know if you've read the book, but it's a very carefully reasoned and very carefully argued book that basically shows, yes, there is systemic anti-white racism going on in our culture, in Western cultures in general. And that's bad. Obviously that's bad for white people, but really it's bad for everybody, for this to be happening. And he's got great suggestions, I think, about different things that can be done about it. But what I've seen is there's a kind of white identity politics that has emerged. Jeremy Carl's book doesn't encourage that. But I think people who've recognized the problem, you've kind of got these angry young men who think, well, and we've done episodes on White Boy Summer and some of these things. That's where you see a lot of this kind of come out. This kind of, there's, Black Lives Matter, so we need to form a white supremacist sort of identity group.
Right.
We need to do identitarian racial politics also as our pushback against that. So that's one thing I noticed. The other thing is, and we've talked about this, and I've been on other podcasts too, I've talked about this, but the anti-Semitism. Where the Jews are scapegoated as basically, like you can trace back everything that's wrong with our culture, everything that's gone wrong with our culture. You can trace it back to Jews, that they are this nefarious influence. And not just that they're a bad influence, but that they are uniquely evil, that they are the most evil, most menacing group in the world. And therefore, we have to have a special opposition and even a special hatred directed towards them. Okay. Right. I think on both. So I have posted some things about these issues, you could say sort of for discussion purposes, but maybe even to some degree for research purposes, just to see what kind of feedback is out there and what kind of responses I get. And of course, some have been quite disturbing when I will push back against racial identity politics from the right or raise questions about the anti-Semitic narrative. So just a couple. I'll just say a couple things about this, and we can either discuss it more if you've got some thoughts on it, Larson, or move on to something else. White identity politics is not going to be the answer to our current cultural crisis. I think that there are some people who, because they're sloppy thinkers, they think that, for example, if you want the law enforced with regard to immigration. So, for example, you want us to have a border, you want us to vet immigrants, you want us to deport those who are here illegally. That if you're saying all those things, that you're going to be accused of racism, and hey, yeah, actually that is racism, but actually it turns out racism's really good. I mean, that seems to be how some people are reasoning this through. I would say no. What we're really talking about here is the rule of law. Even if every last illegal immigrant got deported, America is still going to be a multiracial society, and we still have to figure out how we can get along with each other in a multiracial society. You're not going to undo that. So yes, there are illegals. Most of them are racial minorities in America, but even if you deported all of them, that doesn't make us racially homogenous, obviously. So you still have to have some understanding of how different races can in some way function together if we're going to have a workable society. And it seems like a lot of these guys, I think this is where the racism comes in part of me. I think some of them say, no, we need to have a strictly white nation. So they really do believe in a kind of white nationalism. I won't call it white Christian nationalism because I don't think there's very much Christian content in it at that point. But you do see this happening. And I would just say racial identity politics is not the answer. It's not going to be the kind of platform that could ever get traction in the real world. It might be seemingly popular in a bubble on X, but in the real world, it's not. And also, it's simply unjust. We should oppose DEI, and we should oppose affirmative action, and we should oppose illegal immigration. I would say not because of some kind of white identity politics, but simply because we want what is just, because we are in the pursuit of justice. And justice does include doing what is best for our nation, but it also includes acting according to the law of God. And when partiality infects a political system, obviously in our daily lives, you have to show partiality. you're partial to your kids, I'm partial to my kids. I don't pay your kids medical bills and you don't pay mine. We look out for our own. Those are where our responsibilities are. Those are where our duties are. So you do have a kind of partiality in daily life, but you must not let partiality infect your legal system, your judicial system, your political system, because when it does, it creates all kinds of injustice. And DEI and affirmative action and things of that nature, they are forms of injustice, and we ought to oppose them on those grounds, not because
Yep.
we're right,
Yep.
but because these things are simply wrong.
Right. Yeah. My take, we've talked plenty about this, and I won't get into all the arguments necessarily about the race stuff, because I feel like I've talked about it enough, but it does come back to the sense that I have that so many modern Christians just don't have any robust intellectual or spiritual immune system. There's just such a lack of clear thinking, clear logical biblical thinking, and it's because so many of us grew up in public schools and went to state schools and just have not been trained well, and our churches aren't really doing much to supplement what was missing there. And so I think that we have so many people that are just fools that fall for really dumb things, and so I think that's a huge part of it. And I don't, I know that that's not going to be received well by these guys who want to call me a boomer, but it's like, what was the recent one? I feel like there was some recent, there was like the Wesley Huff podcast with Joe Rogan, or debate with the Billy Carson guy, where you get this guy who, he's a pagan version of, or a non-Christian version of, the Ogden podcast about Bigfoot, or whatever it's called, the Haunted Cosmos. It's like people who get real obsessed with like really fringe, conspiracy theory stuff, and they're con men. They sound very confident in what they say. They're confidence men, but when you have a legitimate historian and expert sitting in front of you, it just all melts away and you look incredibly stupid. And it's just, right now you can get away with so many dumb conspiracies, including like one of the biggest ones is like the flat earth stuff. And it's just like, that gets traction these days because people are so poorly educated. So that's one of the things. The other thing I'd mention is, I'm reading what's her name? Rebecca DeYoung, I believe is her name. Her book, Glittering Vices. I don't know if you've seen this book. It's phenomenal. I'm not very far into it yet, but I'm just finishing the chapter on vainglory, and it's so profound. And our ancestors and forebears in the faith really spent a lot of time meditating on their own sin, on their own hearts, on the deceptiveness of their hearts, and that we've received these 7 deadly sins, that the church is historically, a lot of the great thinkers and teachers of the church historically have said these are 7 particular sins that we should pay special attention to and really guard against, right? And just the idea of focusing and meditating and researching and studying about your own sin and your own sinful inclinations versus studying and meditating on the sins and problems out there in the world that are causing all of the problems in the universe. The line between good and evil runs down the center of our hearts, and who was it? Was it Chesterton who said, what's wrong with the world, and or something, and his answer was me.
I am.
Like that's a Christian, it's the Christian approach to life is we're supposed to pray in the Lord's Prayer, forgive me as I forgive others. It's like, our mindset needs to be oriented towards confessing our own sin and then judging other people by the standard that we want to be judged by, and it just doesn't, like, that sort of mindset, of focus, circumspection or introspection, is just so absent in modern Christianity. At least in our circles, it feels like everybody just wants to talk about all the problems out there, and I think that's a big part of this problem.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think I think you're right about that. And in a way, I think that's what ties in with the anti-Semitism stuff is that,
Yeah.
I mean, Doug Wilson has talked about, and I think we talked about this with Doug some on this podcast, that he thinks a lot of the anti-Semitism is driven by envy. And I certainly think that's a possibility because,
For sure.
as he puts it, Jews are high performing people. I also think that there are other things going on. And I think that some of the concern about the influence of Jews or Judaism is legit in this way. Let me explain it here. This is what I've seen happen again. So I talked about there's sloppiness with the white identity politics. There is sloppiness when it comes to talking about Jews as well, and I've seen this pop up. I mean, this was probably the thing that was the most disturbing and surprising to me when I sort of started posting a good bit on X. How many sort of anonymous anti-Semitic accounts would sort of come and push back and argue against whatever I was saying. But it was also so it was disturbing, but it was also informative because I didn't know this was out there. But you will hear people make the claim Jews they are uniquely evil. They're a uniquely evil presence in our society because the Talmud teaches that Jesus is burning in excrement. And also it's Jews who run the pornography business. It's Jews who are heavily involved in Hollywood and the corruption it pushes on us. Jews are heavily involved in pop music and how that shapes culture in a corrupting kind of way. They're heavily involved in banking and high finance and politics, and always using their influence in very nefarious ways. Okay, so they hold to the Talmud that says Jesus is burning excrement, and they are also pushing all these progressive, this very progressive agenda on us. Well, here's the problem with that. And this is why I say it's sloppy thinking. I do not object at all to generalizations about people groups. If you have a people group, you can make a generalization about them. But so think about what Paul says about the Cretans in Titus 1, or how Jesus generalized about the Pharisees. Even though we know that there were some godly Pharisees, Jesus can still generalize about them in very negative ways.
Yeah.
But for the generalization to work, it has to be accurate and it needs to be insightful in some kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not convinced that the kinds of generalizations I'm seeing a lot of people make, especially anonymous accounts, the generalizations I see them making, I'm not sure they really are accurate, because I think they're actually they're confused and confusing. So let me just lay this out. You have all different kinds of Jews out there, and you have some who are only ethnic Jews. Religion's not a part of it. They might be atheists. In many cases, they are. You also have what we call Orthodox Jews. And of course, even within that, there's all different subgroups, just like we've got different denominations of Christians. You could even say conservative Christians. You still have all different kinds of subgroups to distinguish from one another. The Jews who believe the Talmud, the Jews who would hold to the Talmud, which says Jesus is burning in a pile of excrement, which is obviously blasphemous, those Jews are also extremely politically and socially conservative. In fact, on the whole, as a generalization, they are more conservative than evangelicals. Guys, I saw something right around the time of the election. There were subgroups within Orthodox Judaism that voted for Trump, upwards of 93%. Okay? Evangelicals don't get 93% of the vote cast for the more conservative candidate. Okay, so Orthodox Jews who believe blasphemous things about Jesus are, in an odd sort of way, co-belligerents and allies on many fronts in the culture war. On the other hand, those Jews that are secular and progressive people, they don't believe the Talmud at all, because they're not observant in that kind of way. But it is true, they're very involved in politics and economics and the movie industry, the music industry, and so forth in ways that are very corrupting. But I'm not sure that their ethnicity really has a whole lot to do with it, because their involvement is really, I mean, they may be more, again, higher performing in a certain way, but I'm not sure that their involvement's any different than all the Gentiles who are involved in those industries as well. And of course, there are plenty. But it would kind of like this. What if I said, the problem with the Roman Catholic Church is that they're opposed to birth control and they promote abortion at a really high level.
Right.
Well, you would know that, I mean, the Roman Catholics, you could say, yes, the official teaching of the Roman Catholic Church is to prohibit birth control, but it's only a tiny minority of Roman Catholics who actually practice that, who take the no birth control.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
The majority of Roman Catholics in America are basically liberal, progressive people. I won't say they're fully secular, but they're very they're very progressive politically. They're sort of nominally religiously. They still say they're Roman Catholics, but they're pro-choice. And so, of course, they're not opposed to birth control. They think you can kill a baby, as a form of birth control. So you can see that if you're going to make a generalization about Roman Catholics that's meaningful, that's accurate and insightful, you really have to break it down. You could do the same thing with Presbyterians. I mean, if I said, as I heard somebody else say, if you say, the problem with those Presbyterians, like let's say Roman Catholics said this about Presbyterians, the problem with Presbyterians is they believe the Pope is the Antichrist and they have lesbian pastors.
Right.
Well, I mean, the Presbyterians who believe the Pope is the Antichrist is a tiny sliver of hyper-conservative Presbyterians who certainly don't have lesbian pastors or even female pastors. And the Presbyterians who have the lesbian pastors certainly don't believe the Westminster Confession of Faith, and probably don't even know what it says about the Pope and the Antichrist, and have no interest in that whatsoever. So it's just useless as a kind of generalization. So I think we just have to be careful. So I am concerned about the negative influence that you could say Jewish people have on our society insofar as they do, but I'm not at all convinced that they are uniquely evil or a greater menace than other groups. And I'm not even really sure how you would begin to calculate that in our society. I mean, how many evil points do they get?
Well, and that's to me, like, you cut to the chase on all of this stuff. And the first question is, in my mind, is before we start debating the facts, let's grant that your thesis is true. So what? What are we going to do about this?
Right. What's the cash value?
And that's the conversation that, if what comes next is not something that you can back up biblically, as something we're commanded to do, or something that's reasonable or righteous, then this whole conversation is silly. And so, like, that's where I got to with when this stuff first got on my radar. It was people telling me, well, we're just noticing, and there's nothing wrong with noticing. And I'm like, no, there is something wrong with noticing. It would be, it's like saying you notice, a fire in a crowded theater or whatever. You like saying, like, how you say it, what you say, has an impact, has meaning, and has accomplishes something. So if you're saying, and I remember seeing Stephen Wolf or somebody post, something like, white Europeans are responsible for, most of the great civilizations on the planet, or something like that, and it was like, okay, so what? It's like you're too, you just want engagement. I mean, that's what I worry about, is you just want engagement. That if you leave the ... ellipsis, at the end of that statement, and you don't finish the thought, that the internet's going to rush in to finish the thought for you. And it's going to be a lot of ugly things, but you don't have to take responsibility for all the things that you sort of led people right up to the edge of and then stopped. You get to kind of exonerate yourself. Well, I didn't say those things. I was just the commenters. It's like, no, you kind of set the table for them and baited them into it in order to create a firestorm in your comment thread. And so, yeah, if it's like, so anyway, that's where I just feel like this is all, and somehow, because people talk a lot about it, it's just like shots on goal, like that sort of thought process in soccer or any other sports. Like, whatever you take the most shots on, eventually you're going to get something in, and that's kind of a strategy. So it's like in on Twitter, if your life is lived on Twitter, it's not lived on meditating on scripture or meditating on your own sin or meditating even on your the work that's in front of you and how to do it well, or the responsibilities you have. You're going to, if you sit and just observe this stuff long enough and passively consume it, it's going to infect your brain, and it's going to take up a higher and higher sort of priority in your mind, to where you find yourself some days, not long into it, saying, this is the most important issue in the world. This is the most important thing. Like, why isn't everybody talking about this?
Yeah. So again, that's a question I've raised with those who push this sort of anti-Semitic narrative, that the Jews are uniquely evil and uniquely destructive as a presence in our nation, or really any other Western nation. So my question, I mean, obviously I would have posed this on moral grounds, but I've also asked just the very practical question. Okay, so even if that were true, what are we supposed to do with that information? Like, how do you cash that out? What's the cash value of this? How does that change how I live? What am I supposed to do differently? Even if if this fact is true, what's it going to change? The one other thing that ties in with this is, what's called the postwar consensus. And I like Rusty Reno's work in general. I think he's got a really good handle on things, and he's the one who really popularized this terminology of postwar consensus. It's interesting to me because I think a lot of people are using the postwar consensus to do a lot of things that Reno himself would not approve.
Yeah. That's kind of like Christian nationalism, right?
It's being used to drive this this anti-Semitic narrative. And it seems like for these guys who are the sort of the new right anti-Semites, their view of World War II is that, the bad guys actually won because Churchill was worse than Hitler. Hitler was actually a Christian prince. And it's almost like this. Then they also, of course, they will minimize Hitler's crimes. It seems the position amounts to this: the Holocaust didn't happen, but it would have been good if it did. Or something like that. The Holocaust didn't happen because Hitler was not evil; he was good. And and I've read all the a lot of the Holocaust denial stuff. I'm not impressed with it. But then turn around,
did you see?
They're so anti-Semites. You would think that, well, it would have been good if it had happened, right?
Right.
According to your view.
Well, and the problem too that I keep coming back to on social media, and again, I think we need to be on there. I struggle personally to want to engage on it, but I think guys like you should be. I think you should be talking a lot because you have a prophetic role in the world. But the thing that the thing that I was going to mention is the Joseph Spurgeon. I think it was Joseph Spurgeon. Came out with a I don't know, it was like an hour-long podcast or video where he basically just took Corey Mahler's, all of his arguments and statements about not, Hitler being a good Christian and the Nazis being basically like this conservative Christian movement. And he just dismantled it, he just completely dismantled it. But here's the problem. And I see this all the time on social media is, a lie travels around the world 7 times before the truth has even gotten its shoes laced up,
Right.
And I feel like these guys who are just glued to their Twitter feeds, they've already gone through several iterations of back and forth about these topics. And God forbid the people that they're upset with take a few weeks to provide a measured response. It's like by then they've already strung them up 100 times, effigies and are doing their dances, victory dances. And so it's like by the time you give a reasonable, well-researched, thoughtful response, the paint's already dry or the concrete's already set,
Right. No, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, there is very little reasoned thought on Twitter. Now, when you find it, it's really good. And, because there's enough accounts out there that are just real gems full of insight and some good conversation can come out of that. But of course, there's a lot of there's a lot of trash,
Well,
a lot of garbage there.
yeah, I mean, we've been talking a lot about this at our church, but the progression in Scripture from priest to king to prophet, and sort of that being a model for Christian life, where it starts with just the law, and it's yes, no, do not touch, very black and white, and then you're moving into wisdom and ruling, and ultimately, if God calls you to it, you're given a prophetic voice. The Twitter offers you a prophetic voice. It offers you influence. That's kind of I think I've seen multiple times studies where if you ask kids these days, what's your number one job? It used to be doctor, lawyer, firefighter, airline pilot. Like when you'd ask kids, what are your, those are the types of jobs that were topping the list.
Jobs that require skill, training, and competence.
Yeah. And the number one job that people, when you ask kids these days what you want to do when you grow up, is influencer, social media influencer, like by far.
Which is kind of like saying my goal in life is to be, popular in middle school. I mean,
right. It's 100% vainglory. It's, right. I don't want to be good at something and praised for excellence. I just want the praise.
Right,
I just want the praise. Right. I don't care how I get it. I just want the praise. And so Twitter offers influence. And so guys crave, that to have a prophetic voice, even if God hasn't given them that office, and they get on there and they think they're being influential, but they're not at all. They're 100% being influenced. They're saying what the algorithm is training them. The algorithm is training them how to say things in such a way that you will get the feeling that you are an influencer, and the algorithm is training you to recognize the topics that are going to make you feel more and more like an influencer, and it's all vanity. I mean, it's all vanity. So yeah, I think guys like you need to be on there more, and I think elders need to be on there more. And I think need to know their flock's Twitter handles, and whether or not their flock have anonymous Twitter handles. I think that's just part of shepherding the flock in this day and age, I think.
Larson, how would you say to go about figuring that out with, I mean, you're a ruling elder, I'm a pastor. Yeah. How would you say sessions, so pastors and ruling elders together, should go about figuring that out in their congregation in terms of who's active on social media?
I don't think it's hard, Rich, because 90% of the people you don't have to worry about. I mean, 90% of the people, the ones who have a problem and probably have anonymous accounts and are probably causing a lot of problems on the internet, they're the ones who you can tell, they've got sin issues that are cropping up. They're the ones whose marriages are falling apart and who can't hold down a job and are needing assistance from the church and that sort of thing. Like those are the guys that you need to go, hey, let's talk real quick about your internet habits. Like, okay, we've talked about pornography, like that's something, but tell me about how much time you spend on X, and how many accounts do you have? I mean, I think it's in the context of people, like if somebody's, it's like if you're called to come, if somebody calls you to their bedside to anoint them with oil and pray, for healing, it's the tradition, the Christian tradition is to start by confession of sin, like let's start there. And so I think in the same way, if somebody's calling you and saying, I need help with my finances, or I need help with my marriage, or I need help with my porn addiction, I think that's an opportunity to go, well, let's talk about the bigger picture, because sin grows in clusters. It almost never grows, individually. It always kind of grows like grapes in clusters. And so let's look at all this other stuff. So I think that's probably more where this needs to happen than just like some, email blast that I need a list of all your Twitter handles up front. I mean, if somebody's joining your church, we are kind of trying to screen for what kind of podcasts are you listening to, and as a way to just kind of get a sense for where these people are at and who they're being influenced by.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. That's a good thought.
but you kind of go from there, use your judgment.
I think that's great. I want to say one more thing, and we can move on to the
Yeah.
the next topic. I think we have
Yeah.
one more thing we're going to talk about. But you mentioned good work that had been done on Hitler and Nazism and some World War II issues, anti-Semitism, all of that. Will Spencer did a very good podcast on this, where he basically shows that Hitler was a neo-pagan. Hitler was not a Christian prince in any sense whatsoever. Like a lot of politicians, he co-opted certain language and categories of the Christian faith. I mean, Joe Biden, of course, says he's a Christian.
Yeah, of course.
So Hitler used Christian categories and language when it was convenient. But in terms of the actual content of Nazism, the philosophy of Nazism, it was definitely not Christian. It was a mix of neo-pagan environmentalism and Nietzsche and just all kinds of other stuff, but certainly not biblical Christianity. It's not to say it never had any overlap, and it's not to say that, I mean, the Nazis created the Volkswagen Beetle. Okay, so you can appreciate that the Beetle was a lovely car for its time, while still opposing what the Nazi philosophy stood for. Also, there's a Twitter account called Hitler Hated Christ, and he has done a video that pushes back on the Stone Choir, Corey Mahler, those guys, the evidence they've tried to put forward that Hitler was a Christian, and that his anti-Semitism is even used as proof that he's a faithful Christian. And that account, Hitler Hated Christ, he's done a video, I think actually maybe now multiple videos, but the whole account's pretty good in just debunking a lot of that stuff and going into those who want to argue that there's not really very much evidence for the Holocaust. He really pushes back hard against that, and that's really helpful too. So if somebody out there listening is interested in those questions, so those would be two things to dig up. I think the Will Spencer video was sometime maybe like back in November, and the Hitler Hated Christ, that's been more recent, probably just in the last month or so that he's put that out.
Yeah, maybe that's the guy. Is that the name of his Twitter handle? Hitler
I think it's Hitler Hated Christ. Yeah, I think that's.
Yeah, I think that's where I saw it posted. So I don't know if it was Will Spencer. I think I said Joseph Spurgeon, but maybe that's who I first.
Well, Hitler Hated Christ did one that I think he did himself, actually. So that may be what you're thinking of. But
it was really good. It was really good. The one I watched, and I think it was on that channel or on that. But yeah, I mean, it just comes back to though, like the examples I gave of earlier of the Wesley Huff guy. I don't know if you saw that podcast,
I did.
Or if you saw any of the debate. I mean, he just demolished this guy. I mean, this guy just looked. But you hear the guy make his sweeping claims, and he drops a bunch of names of a bunch of historical facts and figures and things, and it just sounds so legitimate. He says it with such confidence that it sounds legitimate. And for 99% of us who aren't experts, you hear it and you go, "Oh wow, that kind of sounds legitimate." And it's not until there's a true bona fide expert sitting there across the table that just has all the facts right at their disposal that you all of a sudden realize, this is completely ridiculous. And I just feel like that's where we're at with a lot of this stuff. These lies make it around the world 7 times before the truth.
Yeah, the Wesley Huff, and I did not know Wesley Huff until just in the last few weeks, where he got instant fame and recognition by through this podcast debate he did with, I think the name is Billy Carson, where he just demolished the guy who clearly did not know what he was talking about. And then that was a springboard onto the Joe Rogan show, which of course is the most popular podcast in the world. And I listened to a good bit of that interview, and there were 2 things about it that stood out to me. One, as was pointed out on Twitter, this is this may be the largest platform, like singular platform, the gospel's ever had, because the reach of Joe Rogan is so extensive. And of course, Rogan is cussing up a storm like he always does. and Huff is very, just kind of calm and composed to the whole, not fazed by it at all. I was very impressed with his demeanor, and of course, just thrilled to see him present the gospel in that context. But the thing that stood out to me too is that, we have spent a lot of time, especially since COVID, attacking the so-called experts, because the experts aren't really experts. Our elites are not really elite.
Well, they're faux experts. Yeah,
they're genuine elite expert in his field, and you see how much that is appreciated and how it stands out and how valuable it is. We need experts. We need elites, but we need them to be truly experts, to have true excellence and competence in their craft or in their domain. And it was just really interesting to me that, we hear so much about shrinking
Yes.
attention spans and how people can't follow an argument today. But Wesley Huff is making, extended arguments,
Right.
detailed arguments, and people are following because he knows what he's talking about, and they can tell that. Sort of like the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. I mean, Peterson obviously not a Christian, but he's got interesting things to say.
Well, and he is an expert in his field.
He's got a level of expertise, and that's why people will listen. So I would say what that means for us as Christian men is expertise still pays off. There will never be any substitute for competence. Whatever your domain is, whatever your craft is, pursue excellence in that and trust that God will use that to make a difference in the lives of people around you and in the world.
It's back to the proverb. See a man skillful in his work, he'll stand before kings. If you desire, and this is kind of the underarching or overarching theme of this whole thing is all of this stupid stuff on Twitter is in the context, for the most part, of people wanting to talk about Christian nationalism and how to make America a Christian nation. And really what they're talking about is culture wars. How do we engage in culture and change culture? And their whole premise is wrong. They think it's going to happen through politics first and through social media. And instead of hearing what Scripture says, which is, if you want a seat at the table before kings, be excellent in whatever it is that you do. Just be the best in the world, and you will find yourself sitting at the table of the king and having influence, and if you're patient and you're not just a whore, who's just desperate for attention, and then your day's going to come. Wesley Huff, such a lovely example of that. It's like, I'm delighted to know that I've never heard of this guy, and delighted to find that this guy has, so much depth of knowledge and expertise.
Yeah, he's a Calvinist, runs an apologetic ministry, obviously very good at what he does with ancient manuscripts. Let me say one other thing. I mean, I know I keep saying we'll move on to our last topic, but one other thing that you made me think about this with what you just said. Guys who think that we're going to change the world through social media. Right. I was talking about, pushback I've gotten on different things I've said. Like when I've said, like, you can't beat racism with racism, or you can't defeat identity politics with identity politics. Like, that you've got this anti-white DEI regime going, anti-male, anti-white, really anti-Christian. Okay. But it's the whiteness, the anti-whiteness that really has grabbed people's attention. And that's where you see the most, the most agitation. And so I've just said, like, the answer to this is not a white identity politics. And I've said, things like, there was such a thing as lawful immigration in ancient Israel. But what is very clear is that there is to be one law for the Israelite and for the immigrant. So there's no partiality in Israel's legal system, one in one direction or the other. But guys have accused me of doing things like counter signaling, which that was kind of a new thing to me, like counter signaling the Trump administration on immigration, because by just acknowledging that there could be lawful immigration into ancient Israel under Torah, I'm somehow softening the argument that illegals need to be deported right now. And I'm like, wait a second, first of all, I'm just stating facts, and I mean, my goal in life is not to, serve the Trump administration. I serve the Lord Jesus Christ, and I want to teach what the Bible says, not, I'm not pushing the Republican Party platform. I'm pushing the Bible. But also the fact that people, I think some people really think the way we're going to win this war is by generating enough momentum for our position on Twitter. And so if I say something that adds wrinkles or nuances, okay, because I'm not opposed to finding ways to remove illegal aliens from the country, okay, whether it's through forced deportation or willing deportation because we've taken away welfare benefits or whatever. But it's kind of like people were thinking that I'm somehow jeopardizing the cause by saying true things, but things that don't serve this particular end. And I think that whole way of thinking about cultural change and cultural transformation and political change, I mean, it was kind of eye opening. I'm like, oh, wait a second. The reason these guys, in some cases, are opposing me so strongly on Twitter is not even because they necessarily would disagree with my argument, like in the abstract as an argument, but just because they think it is quote unquote counter signaling. Okay. Well, I mean, I think stuff like counter signaling and other, kind of passive aggressive kind of things. I mean, that's for middle school girls. I mean, I think it's just kind of silly.
Right.
And besides that, the Trump administration is not waiting around to see my next tweet to decide what to do about immigrants. I mean, I do think if you engage in social media, everybody who engages in social media does it because at some level they want to influence. They want to influence people in the world around them, obviously. So we're all trying to be influencers in that sense. But I think we also have to be realistic, and we also have to just be honest about the situation. We're not going to change the world one tweet at a time. That's not going to be the main avenue for cultural change. Now, if you are engaging with President Trump, or like some people have gotten engaged with Elon Musk on Twitter over, say, like the HB1 visa issue, I mean, that you do have an opportunity there to maybe alter the conversation a little bit. But even then, you're just one of millions upon millions of voices,
right?
And you should not overestimate the impact of your tweets.
Right. And the thing that to get back to here that I think is important is, I think coming back to that priest, king, prophet analogy is really helpful, because what I see are the next generation of Christian leaders who want to have the kind of ministry that a guy like Douglas Wilson has, and they want to have the kind of influence that a guy like Douglas Wilson has. And so they jump to, well, we got to get the follower count that Doug Wilson has, as if that's how you unlock, the influence of a guy like Doug Wilson. And it's they've completely inverted it. It's like saying, I wish my car would go as fast as that race car. I'm going to go paint it the same colors. It's like,
right.
No, that's not how you get a fast race car. You need to look at what's under the hood. And so I think in the same case, Doug has influence, and now has more of an media apparatus around him that's developed over decades of faithful ministry organically. And the next generation wants to go, well, let's start with building a media apparatus, a slick marketing media apparatus, and let's build the followers. And I think they're skipping, and I think they're grasping at something the Lord hasn't given them yet. And they're skipping the massively important step of actually doing the work to actually have a prophetic voice. And I'm, here I am, a 40 something year old dude that has a podcast. I have this podcast with you because you were somebody like Doug who's done the work, and has something to say. And so I enjoy being a part of the conversation and spurring the conversation along, but I fully go into this recognizing I'm not the teaching elder. I'm not the guy that's put in the work of decades of study,
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. And I think you're right. I think, I've heard people complain about how, Doug's got this really loud megaphone basically, but I'm like, Doug earned whatever influence he has. And to me, it's a little bit ridiculous to see some of these young guys attack Doug over things that are honestly kind of ridiculous. But yeah, Doug has earned that through hard work and through competence and through being uniquely gifted in a lot of ways. So yeah. It's really interesting to me. To a little bit concerning.
Well, Rich, we had one more topic, but do you want to dive into it, or do you want to save it for our next episode?
I'll tell you what, let's save it. Yeah, let's save it. We were going to talk about women in combat because the Pete Hegseth confirmation hearing was yesterday, and women in combat was a huge topic in that conversation. And I think that there's a lot of interesting things that you can say about that issue.
Yeah. And I wanted to pile onto that, the topic of women in college, because I feel like that's also something that, I've heard and seen lots of people in our circles assert that women shouldn't go to college, and it's a great way to turn them into liberals or whatever, and it's not protecting your daughters and stuff. So I feel like those two are sort of related, and so we'll make that a teaser for our next.
That's great.
Next episode.
There we go. You got we gave them a little preview of what's coming on the next episode. We don't usually do that. We usually don't know what's coming on.
We usually don't know
until we get on here and start talking.
Yeah. Well, hey, this was a lot of fun, Rich. It's been too long.
Yeah,
and since we've got a topic, we'll have to quickly get back together to record our next one.
Indeed.
Awesome.
Thanks, Larson.
Well, hey, man. Yeah. Have a good day.
All right. Thanks, you too.
The God a Minute podcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you like this podcast, you might enjoy one of our other podcasts, The Good Life Podcast, featuring Matt Carpenter interviewing experts in their field about how their work contributes to the good life.